There we go. All right, thanks. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Michael, event host here at RJ Julia. Got Pim as well, another event host. We're excited to be here tonight with Erik Hesselberg to discuss the new book.
Stop everything. Hold on.
Nightboat to New York. You perfect time.
Thank you.
Come
Thank
on.
you.
Yeah, we got a few more chairs.
Thank you.
Back there. Excellent. So after just a brief introduction, we'll tell you a little bit more about the book, but then we'll have a chance to hear from our wonderful author. We'll take questions a little bit later from the audience, and then after we're wrapped up in here, we'll go in the other room for an author signing, a little meet and greet. You can personalize your books also. There's copies. If you didn't already get a copy of the new book, we have those at the registers in the other room also. Erik Hesselberg has been writing about the Connecticut River for 20 years, first as an environmental reporter for the Middletown Press, and later as executive editor of Shoreline newspapers. He was president of the Middlesex County Historical Society and is a regular contributor to the Hartford Current. He lives in Haddam, Connecticut. Is that right?
That's right.
That's current. That's
right.
right. If you want to find him, that's where you look for him. His book, Nightboat to New York, Steamboats on the Connecticut, 1815 to 1931, is a portrait of the vanished steamboat days when up to 35 sleek steamships were in service on the Connecticut River and through Long Island Sound, carrying passengers primarily from Hartford to New York City. Departing each afternoon from the wharfs in Hartford, the nightboats arrived at their destination at daybreak, carrying people and goods, making transportation not just convenient, but a social phenomenon. This book chronicles the rise and fall of the steamships, with history of familiar landmarks around the state, as well as notable figures who lived and worked in the area at the time. So, turn the time over to Erik.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me out there? Thank you so much for coming. I always had the dream to write a book about Connecticut history and also have a talk at RJ Julia's. So I'm checking two of those things off the list. I used to be the editor of a bunch of newspapers down here. You probably know the Shoreline Times, was kind of our big one. Also a newspaper called Shore View. So it's great to be back in Madison. It almost feels like we're on a steamboat here with everybody sitting down. The great thing about steamboats is that they were very social, it wasn't for people who wanted to kind of be by themselves, and although you could retire to your stateroom, but it was a very good social experience. And I think, writing it in the pandemic was a very kind of, cathartic experience, because I could, here at a time we're all separated, I could kind of return to a time when everybody was jostling on the deck of a steamboat and touching each other and, singing around the piano. I mean, it was a wonderful experience. What is kind of really interesting and a little bit eerie is because of this year's drought, the Connecticut River is as low as I've ever seen it. And so, just like what's happening in Europe, a lot of archaeology sites that are underwater are like coming into view. And one of them on the Connecticut River is the wreck of the Granite State. And I want to thank a woman from, I can't remember her name, who gave me this photo of the timbers of the Granite State. This is a wreck that's always been underwater, even at low tide. But now you can actually see it. And this was a steamboat 300 feet long. So it's pretty remarkable that it's there and kind of haunting, the present, so to speak.
Is that in Saybrook?
That's at the mouth of the river in Old Saybrook. So if we got any boaters there, it's at the entrance to North Cove. So there's a tendency to remember the past more beautiful than the present. We always like to look back at the good old days. But I think with the steamboat, that may be one of the few exceptions that the past was probably better. I mean, there was no experience quite like it. I have a description of steamboats, of a Hudson River steamboat from that period. Our riverboats are long, shallow, and graceful, and painted as brilliantly and fantastically as an Indian shell. With her bow just leaning up from the surface of the stream, her cutwater throwing off a curved and transparent sheet from either side, her white awnings, her magical speed, and the gay spectacle of 1,000 well-dressed people on her decks, I know of nothing prettier. I was really lucky to be on Where We Live with Lucy Nalpathanchel, and she read that quote, and I have to say, she did such a beautiful job. It sounded so good. So I wish I had her voice for that. But anyway, so Nightboat to New York is really the story of a vanished world. It's hard to believe, and a lot of people don't realize this, that 300-foot boats, or nearly 300-foot boats, plied the Connecticut River between Hartford and New York. Of course, they went down the river and they went through Long Island Sound. Most of us, when we think of steamboats, we think of Mississippi River steamboats. And probably because of Mark Twain, who lived in Hartford, who, by the way, wrote most of his famous works in Hartford. And never spoke of riding a Connecticut River steamboat, although he did, and I have in the book you'll see a description of when he did that, but he never mentioned steamboats. And I don't think he actually took a steamboat back and forth to New York, because he wanted to get to New York as fast as possible, and the fastest way was the train, and he could take the train, very conveniently from Hartford. Anyway, Twain, of course, it's hard to beat his descriptions of the Mississippi River and steamboats. And I have his description of a steamboat coming up to a landing. And he describes it as follows. Presently, a film of dark smoke appears above one of those remote points. And instantly, a drayman, famous for his quick eye and prodigious voice, lifts up the cry of "Steamboat a-comin'!" Drays, carts, men's boys, all go hurrying from many quarters to a common center, the wharf. Assembled there, the people fasten their eyes upon the coming boat as upon a wonder they are seeing for the first time. Now, that same excitement of the arrival of a steamboat, happened on the Connecticut River a couple times a day. There were 14 stops between Hartford and Saybrook, and so every town, Essex, Saybrook, Middletown, was essentially a port. At Middletown, 40 stevedores were needed to load all the freight. 40 men, you can imagine how much freight. And what we shipped out of Middletown were typewriters, rubber goods, cast iron pumps, pistols, enamelware, marine hardware, and much more. In spring, does anyone like shad? Have you ever tried Connecticut River shad? Well, shad was shipped overnight on the steamboat to New York. Cotton came up the river to East Haddam for the spinning mills of Lewis. Probably the most exotic cargo were ivory elephant tusks, which had come all the way from Africa, and they were shipped, to New York, and then shipped up the river for the piano factories. Connecticut River steamboats were called night boats because, of course, the voyage was at night. So that's one thing. What's very interesting, there's a lot of photos in the book, but one of the reasons that not a lot is known about Connecticut River steamboats is because they did travel at night, and so they were hard to photograph at night, during the period when after the Civil War. So we don't have a lot of photographs. Most of the photographs we do have of Connecticut River steamboats are the later ones, and also if there was a wreck. So there were a couple of famous wrecks on the river, and we have some wonderful images of those. So the route was Hartford to New York. You departed in the afternoon, say 5 o'clock, and steamed down the river to Long Island Sound. It was about 6 hours up the Sound to the East River to Hellgate, and down the East River, docking under the Brooklyn Bridge. The trip took about 11 hours, so it was an overnight trip. You got on in the afternoon. I mean, one woman used to remember the steamboat, and she would always say it was so beautiful. You'd go to sleep on the Connecticut River and wake up in New York. So, to talk about how to orient people, in a sense, the Brooklyn Bridge is where the slip was, and so if you left at 5, you would be heading northward up the East River to Hellgate. And Hellgate, do we have any boaters here? Yeah, I don't know if you traveled through Hellgate, but Hellgate now is still quite this is where the tides rush in and out of Long Island Sound. It's a pretty narrow passage, and you really feel the tremendous force of the tide. And Hellgate, in the steamboat age, was even more treacherous because there were rocks that you could get hung up on, and boiling rapids, and it was really that's why it was called Hellgate, named by the Dutch. So Lillian Brooks, who I write about in the book, she lived in Brooklyn, and her family was very fashionable for New York families, Brooklyn families, well-to-do New York families, to have a summer house maybe on the shore or on the Connecticut River. And Lillian took the steamboat in the early 1900s, and she wrote about it years later. But here's how she describes taking the steamboat. Around 1910. The adventure began in the middle of June, when trunks were packed and made ready, and family pets were rounded up. A horse, a dog, and cat, and even chickens, about 2 dozen, were crated for the trip. All were put on a flatbed. Now, she lived in Brooklyn, so all were put on a flatbed wagon, pulled by 4 horses, and carried across the Brooklyn Bridge to Pier 24 on the East River, also known as Peck Slip. Later, the family was driven in horse-drawn coaches to the same dock, where either the Middletown or the Hartford would be waiting, having left Hartford the night before at 5 p.m. It was an exciting trip for youngsters. We roamed the boat from the captain's quarters to the decks and down below into the hold to visit our pets. When the boat reached East Haddam, about 4 o'clock in the morning, a deep voice called, "Rock Landing, Haddam Neck, next stop." Rock Landing was Haddam Neck. It wasn't called Haddam Neck, it was called Rock Landing. There was a big rock there. And there we were met by a carriage, and Mr. and Mrs. Frank House welcomed us, took us to our house at the top of the hill, where a warm wood stove and a substantial hot breakfast was waiting. So that was the most exciting, that was a real thrill for her to take the steamboat, every year to her summer place. So I described some of the, we're going to get to some slides afterwards. Well, I'll show you where the route was. One of the last landmarks that you left, as you left the East River and headed into Long Island Sound, off your starboard bow, I guess, would be the grimly named Execution Rock. And I think, is it still called, it's still there. Execution Rock was named by the Dutch, and it was where they brought prisoners and chained them. And, I guess if they had to confess something, perhaps they would leave them there overnight, and by the next day they spilled the beans. Or they left them there to perish. That's why it's called Execution Rock. So as the pilot was steaming across the Sound, he would mark places like Execution Rock, these various navigation points, and he would note down his time, and I'm going to show you that afterwards, and so on. And this system kind of kept track of his position. One really nice feature was that while you were leaving New York, another boat, the companion boat, was leaving Hartford. So about halfway, which was kind of the mouth of the river, both boats met. And, the captains would pull the steamboat whistle. I want to see if I can do this. I actually have a whistle that you can hear. And to kind of bring you back to what that might have sounded like. That's a Mississippi steamboat, but very much each steamboat had its own particular whistle, and each captain kind of had his own little finesse of how he would play, and you could hear that little bit of it almost, I mean, it really sounds like kind of a living, kind of breathing thing. So the captains met, usually the boats met at the mouth of the river, and then they steamed up. And I'm going to show you in the slides what the stops were along the way. Since we're in Madison, there's a lot that I want to talk. You could talk about with steamboats, but I don't want to tell you everything, because then you won't buy the book, of course. But one thing I wanted to talk about here a little bit was how the steamboat really led to the summer vacation as we know it. The French scholar Alain Corbin maintains that the discovery of the seashore as a place of resort did not occur until 1750. That was late. We think we've been going to the beach forever. We really haven't. We didn't really start going until the late 1700s. And the English aristocrats made that fashionable by when they began to migrate to seaside destinations like Brighton and Margate. And the whole thing was to enjoy salubrious air, the salt water, and something which was completely new, which was called surf bathing. People didn't, and so you were, in England, you were actually, if you were wealthy enough, you had your own carriage, and your carriage was actually taken out into the water, and they would get you ready. They would carry you to the water, and you would splash around, and then they'd get you back. And that was called surf bathing. Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe. In fact, when I searched the word swimming, on the Hartford Current, and one of the great things about, I used the Hartford Current Digital Archives, and one of the great things about that is you can really see when a trend begins, because you can't find the word really swimming before 1800. And then you start to see bathing and surf bathing around the 1820s, so we really weren't going to the beach to swim. The only time I think I saw bathing was in the early 1800s. Two men in Boston, young boys actually, were arrested for swimming on the Sabbath. And that was how I came upon the word swim. But you couldn't do it, at least until like after 1820. So the first summer resort in this country was on this rocky little island called Nahant. I don't know if people know Nahant, but Nahant was really the first summer resort in the United States, the first seaside summer resort. And this was a modest hotel ringed with verandas. The men would all gather on the lower floors and smoke cigars and read the paper, and the women would congregate on the upper floors and do needlework and things like that. They didn't mix. You couldn't really. And the men usually they could take the steamboat to work in Boston, but they were so exhausted by working at the end of the day that all they were ready for was to have a cigar and a drink and maybe play billiards. Well,
Massachusetts?
Nahant is Massachusetts. Yeah, it's I think it might be in Lynn. It's near Salem, just off the coast. So the Nahant Hotel became very popular, and it became so popular that they opened they started running a steamboat on Sundays, and ministers, Boston ministers, who started to see their congregations dwindle because people were going to the beach on Sundays, protested. And I came across an article in the Boston Advertiser from around 1820, which says, will it be believed that in this good city of Boston, this refuge of pilgrims, the public sentiment is such as to tolerate the running of a steamboat on the Sabbath for the avowed purpose of accommodating those of our citizens who may choose to go as passengers. They tried to ban steamboat trips on Sunday, and I think what the steamboat owners started to do was to hold mass service on the boat, so that they would get around that. Connecticut is really interesting. I was able to really kind of pinpoint when people started to go to the beach in Connecticut, and it really was because of the steamboat. It was around 1820, and the Hartford Current tells us more or less exactly when that occurred. And this is an article from 1823, where the Current says, it has been for a few summers become fashionable for our citizens to resort to places on the seashore for recreation and refreshment, instead of traveling away to the barren scrub oak plains of Saratoga and Ballstown. Those were the big resort places, Saratoga Springs. And Ballston was another mineral place where you went to take the mineral waters. We mean not to disparage the latter as watering places merely, for no mineral waters, probably in the world, are equally palatable and healthy. But as places of residence, there are none more pleasant and inviting in our country than those of our own seaboard. There are numerous establishments from Stonington to Stanford, where travelers can be accommodated with every kind of seafood, so people started to eat seafood, they hadn't done that before, well-cooked and comfortable lodgings, attentive landlords, as well as all the luxuries which are raised from the soil here. The sportsman may indulge himself in the choice of his favorite amusement, fishing, bathing, sailing, and shooting. And if he has a relish for Congress water, that's mineral water, that can be procured too. The watering places of Connecticut on the seaboard are so preferable to any other that we are surprised any of our citizens should resort to Ballstown or Saratoga merely to drink their waters. So that was the Hartford Current, and I was able to, I thought that was very exciting for me, was to see, here, this is the beginning of what we're enjoying now, in a sense, on the seashore. Is not all that old. Clinton was one of the first resorts, a place called the Strangers Resort, but the biggest one was in Sachem's Head, the Sachem's Head Hotel. And that started rather small, and it got bigger and bigger. And by the Civil War, the Sachem's Head Hotel was the largest summer resort between New York and Newport. Newport, of course, they were bigger, but Guilford, which had a very easy connection to New Haven and New York, became a huge, huge summer resort. And Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, whom you've probably heard of, he summered at the Sachem's Head Hotel, and it was there that he decided, his father, who indulged in his sons pretty much whatever he wanted to do. His father was very generous. He owned a dry goods store, and they saw a farm, and it was where he bought an old farm. It was where Olmsted began, his gardening and cultivation. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who dominated steamboats for many years, also summered there. So the important thing about the steamboat is that it was truly modern, in that it established really this pattern of commuting between Connecticut and New York, which continues to this day. Eventually, with a seaside summer resort, people began to say, it's so lovely here. Can't we live here all year round? And of course, modern transportation allows us to do that. So houses got bigger and bigger, and they became permanent places of residence. But it all began with the steamboat. I'm going to go through some slides now to kind of review some of the things that I talked about.
Dim the lights just
Okay.
just a little.
Kind of give you a sense of what the trip was like moving up Long Island Sound.
Okay, for everybody.
Yeah.
We can go to the next one if you would.
Yeah.
That's what the Grand Estate looked like. You saw the timbers. That's what the Grand Estate looked like, and it was already a pretty old boat. It doesn't really look all that elegant here.
Excuse me, Eric?
Yeah.
If you could sit back about one more minute.
Oh, sure.
It'd be easier for us at this accent. Thank you so much.
Dwight, can you see the screen?
Adequately, yeah.
Okay. So I've got next slide here.
Thank you for taking it.
This is an early Connecticut River steamboat called Bunker Hill, and it was a beautiful, beautiful boat. There's an interior of one of the grander Long Island Sound steamboats. Connecticut probably didn't have a steamboat with a ballroom that big, but Long Island Sound, and if you lived in Madison, you would see these big boats parading across the Sound. I mean, that's hard. That looks like an opera house. This is a floating, they were called floating palaces, and they really, really deserved that name. Next slide. I mentioned Mark Twain. Mark Twain, as I said, did not, I searched in vain to find some mention of the Connecticut River or a steamboat, and I could not find it. And I was thinking, I love this guy, but he kind of snubbed Connecticut River steamboat. But I did find a description from the 1940s of a captain talking about how Twain had come up the Connecticut River in around 1900, late 1800s, and how when he was coming up from New York, and how he asked to be awakened at midnight so he could watch the moonlight on the water. And he came up to the pilot house, and he was puffing his pipe, as the pilot describes. And then he was shown around to the pilot house, and he kind of compared them to a Mississippi boat. And then he went out on the deck, and there was a young steward who was kind of following him around to make sure that he had everything he needed. And Twain, at a certain point, dropped his pipe. This is the story they told. And the boy picked it up, and he handed it back to the author, and Twain reaches into his pocket and gave him a silver dollar. And then he looked at the landscape as that was passing by the steamboat, and he said, New England, it's one big park. So that's Mark Twain. And these are kind of the image of what we think of when we think of steamboats. That was, these are Mississippi boats, but as you saw earlier, Connecticut River boats, which had to go on Long Island Sound too, so they had to be ocean going, were longer, sharper, much narrower, and they could not be top heavy like these. Next slide. This is one of the later steamboats without most of Connecticut River boats were sidewheel steamboats. The later ones were steel hull, screw propeller, and this was a twin screw propeller. I think that's the Hartford, and it was just a really beautiful boat. And so that was the steamboat cruising down the Connecticut River, in late afternoon. I talked about that's one of the boats being unloaded in Hartford. Next slide. So Colt firearms were shipped on steamboats, if you can believe it. Crates of pistols, pianos, pretty much everything that we made in the Connecticut Valley was shipped on a steamboat. Ivory. Here's the ivory we talked about. I have a friend who's a piano tuner. He's retired now. But in the book, I have a captain saying that you could get 45 keyboards from one tusk if it was properly cut. And Bruce McLeod is his name. He said, I think you're wrong on that, Eric. And I was thinking, I just relied on this quote. I didn't really check it. And now a piano tuner is saying, I don't think you could get 45. Well, like a couple days later, I got an email from him, and he goes, Eric, 45. You're right. And that wasn't my brilliance. That was the captain that I quoted knew the business so well that he knew that he could get 40. That they could get 45 keyboards from one tusk. Nightboat, so that's what it looked like. And that was really the beauty of traveling on a nightboat was, getting up to the top deck, which was called the hurricane deck. And this would have been on Long Island Sound, and seeing the other boats pass. Next. We can go to the next one. So this is one slip up from Peck Slip. This is, I think, the New Haven slip. So there's the Brooklyn Bridge, and so you're just south of it is where the steamboat's tied up. Next. Yeah, this gives you an idea of really, these are the words, probably 1890s, all the steamboats, and even quite a few, you see the spars and masts from sailing ships. Next. This is a very early, very interesting picture, map of New York, and Peck Slip is kind of in there, right where my finger is. What's really interesting about this is New York about 1830. Is it's really, really crowded at the all these streets and kind of in lower Manhattan, the tip of Manhattan, and then you get up to 30th Street or something, and there's nothing. There was really nothing above that.
Can you show where the Brooklyn Bridge at that one?
Oh yeah, sure. This actually probably this is the route. So there's the East River, as you can see. Yeah, going up there, and so Brooklyn Bridge is like. Right there. There's the Brooklyn Bridge. I think the next one might be Williamstown Bridge. So a lot of bridges now, but there wasn't even the Brooklyn Bridge. For most of the time the steamboats traveled. 1886, I believe, is when the Brooklyn Bridge was built. So, that's the East River, and then up towards where you can see that sign up right there, out back a bit, is Hellgate, that narrow passage. Going actually back a little bit, and that's Rikers Island is right there too.
And then where's Long Island Sound to the right of it?
Yes, Long Island Sound is right up there. So you pretty much steamed out of here, and you're in Long Island Sound. And then what the steamboat did is it got pretty close to shore, so you could always see lights in the towns, off in the distance. Next, Hellgate. This is a description. I don't know if we can read it, but this is from Nathaniel Hawthorne. He wrote a marvelous description of Hellgate. Boiling in whirlpools, brawling and fretting in ripples and breakers, and in short, indulging in all kinds of wrong-headed paroxysms. At such times, woe to any unlucky vessel that ventures within its clutches. Next one. That's another shot of Hellgate. This always reminds me of like the ship in Gilligan's Island, a 3-hour cruise or something. But anyway, you were really tossed about that's steaming through Hellgate. Next one. So there's Long Island Sound. Here is that notation that I talked about. This is a pilot's log, and he just turns out to be a captain that I write about in the book called George Parmalee. I grew up in Haddam on Washley Hill, and the Parmalees are a big name. The Parmalees actually were originally from Guilford. I think they came over in like the 1640s or something. But Captain George Parmalee, an old family, lived in Haddam, and his his grandson was a neighbor of ours, and I never knew, until much later, that he was the grandson of this famous steamboat captain. So this, doing the book kind of was like revisiting my childhood. That was kind of a nice thing. So this is the mouth of the Connecticut River, incredibly shallow, and it's like threading a needle, especially for a steamboat. That's
Sorry.
back a bit. You want to go back
sorry
a bit.
about that. There you go.
And the big marker there was Long Sand Shoal, and there was a lightship which really told you where that was, and that lightship was kind of off Saybrook for years. One of the reasons the Connecticut River was not settled
into like 1835 was John Winthrop, who, you know, brought his Massachusetts Bay Colony over to Massachusetts. He said, you know, they're troublesome Indians for one, and the mouth of the river doesn't have more than 6 feet at the mouth, so you can't get big ships. They began dredging, eventually, you know, there would be at least 15 feet of water, and you probably need 10 or 12 for a steamer. These, we'll scoot that over a little bit. These are the stops. So if we're coming up from Old Saybrook first, Essex, Deep River,
Sorry about that.
Hamburg, which was Lyme, had Lyme, and then Goodspeed's East Haddam, which was really thrived during the steamboat age, had 2 steamboat landings. One where the Opera House is today, and one about a half mile upriver, where a hotel called the Champion House was. And there's still those apartments that are still there, are in the old steamboat hotel. Rock Landing, which was Haddam Neck, Middletown, which was a really kind of big, important stop. South Glastonbury, Hartford. Now, go ahead to the next slide. And maybe the next one. This is Hartford in the 1830s. So the wharf, you can see the State House in the distance, where that wide thoroughfare is. That was where the steamboat tied up, and it was called State Street Landing. So really beautiful waterfront, Hartford, you know, in those early days. It's hard to believe that was, you know, looks like Mystic, really. And the Connecticut River, you know, had a number of ports like that. Next slide. So, to the seashore, I use this slide in the book, and one of the things that also was very interesting was reading about the, you know, the fashions too. That you know, that this looks really like a beauty contest, but this is what ladies swam in. Next slide. Next one. So you can see in paintings too. This might be a Manet, I think, painting, which starts to show, you know, beach scenes, because beaches became fashionable. The next slide. That was we talked about Nahant. That's the Nahant Hotel, and that was considered like the place to be. You know, that little house or kind of, you know, or a little hotel. Next. Long Island Sound. There was a song called On Long Island Sound that was written in the steamboat era. Coney Island, and around, you know, 1880s, and people swimming in the surf was kind of a new thing. And if you swam in these really large wool dresses, you know, you could drown pretty easily. So they had these ropes. See the ropes there that you can hang on to. So you kind of hung on to the rope. The other thing you see, there were all these postcards of men rescuing women and scooping them up. So I think the men intentionally had the ladies wear these heavy skirts so they could rescue. I think that's next one. Yeah. Quickly, I'll just show you, and then we'll open up for questions. This is the largest steamboat that ever ran on the Connecticut River, and it's the State of New York, which ran aground, which actually hit a snag above Goodspeed Landing, and then the pilot was forced to beach opposite. So that's opposite the Goodspeed Opera House, and that's close to a 300-foot steamboat. And this really kind of bankrupted William Goodspeed, who built the Opera House. He had invested heavily in steamboats, and this was really the pride of the fleet, you know. And when it sunk, it cost about $100,000, I think, for him to rebuild, to first get it out of to float it, and then get it downriver and rebuild it.
But the thing about Goodspeed, when he built the Opera House, he was so proud of his steamboat, the state of New York, that he had a painting. He had actually a backdrop, which had the state of New York steaming up the river, just past a place called, right opposite the Opera House. And it was kind of a bad omen, it seems like, because that's exactly where the steamboat ended up sinking. And Goodspeed died just about a year. He was so distraught by his financial losses that I think this was about a year later, he got pneumonia, and he died on Christmas Day, William Goodspeed. So, kind of a tragic ending. And he was broke. He was actually bankrupt at that time. But that was his pride and joy. And this is you can see the figures on deck, the little people, to give you an idea of just how big that was. These were boats that came up the Connecticut River.
Do you know about what year that was?
This is 1882. 1882 is when that sank, yeah.
And these are the paddles on the side you
Yeah.
were describing?
Yes, this is a side wheel boat, so those are the paddles on the side, and they were probably 30 feet in diameter, to give you an idea of how big they were. And then the stacks, of course. And then, I remember this from my last talk, because there was a guy who was an expert at steamboat. Because you didn't talk about the walking beam engine. So I'm going to mention the walking beam engine. This little thing, this kind of teeter-totter, was the steam engine going up and down. So it was kind of like a flywheel almost. That kept going. That was something that you would see in constant motion. And the faster it go, the faster that would move. So there was something, the paddle wheels going, the walking beam moving, the sound of the whistle. It was like a kind of a ride. I mean, it was more than just transportation. It was really a little bit like a carnival ride. And I think that's why it was so much fun. So I'm going to take some questions now. I think if we're ready.
That sounds great. I'll turn the lights.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Anyway. Oh, back it up.
Once someone, the syndicate, built a steamboat for this particular trade, how long would it be before the boat earned its profits back? When was the break even? A year or 2 years or 10 years or lots of times in this case probably never, but
Yes, with a boat like this,
yeah.
probably never. It really depended on how much freight, and it was kind of a balancing act. That's a question in all my research, I did not come across really how in terms of profit, Goodspeed was really always operating kind of right at the break-even point.
Okay.
And I think he did a lot of it because he just enjoyed boats and he brought people up to his hotel. But I think his steamboats always lost money. They really did. And what we found out with Goodspeed is when he finally died, and the New York Times wrote about the steamboat company. He was putting a lot of his own money into the New York Transportation Company, which owned the boat, to really finance repairs and things like that. So he was really never making a profit. Now Vanderbilt was another matter. He had all sorts of tricks for making money. Usually, what Vanderbilt did, Vanderbilt ran boats on the Connecticut River. He would drop his prices to such a degree that the competition would get scared and they'd say, "What do you want to just go away?" And he did that on the Hudson River. And he ended up getting a bribe from a rival steamboat company of like $100,000 to stay off the Hudson for 10 years. So that's what brought him. So he was a genius at that. So it was, there was a lot of ways. He was very successful, but he always was making money, investing in bigger boats, selling those, and then getting faster boats and more boats, and then he got out of steamboats altogether, invested in railroads, Panama shipping. So he was kind of unique that way.
How much water would the average steamboat draw?
About
10 feet, 12 feet, more or less. Mark Twain, his name comes from 2 fathoms deep, and that was really steamboat jargon for safe, enough water to pass. So 12 feet was considered, safe, and once they got under 12 feet, they started to get a little worried. Of course, there's all these stories about, Mississippi steamboats could run on like the moisture on the side of a glass or something. But, you really needed 10 to 12 feet. So a steamboat could not run on the Connecticut River today. And the only way they were able to do that then is that the river was dredged, fairly early, in the, 1820s, 1830s. There was a regular program of dredging.
What was this?
Oh, yeah.
What was the season for this?
Good question. That's the season. Steamboats did not run all year long. Winters were constantly cold, and the river froze over for about 2 months. So it usually ended in December, and the steamboats didn't start running again until March. So they usually closed down for a couple of months.
So Eric, this is really not a question, but it's more of an observation. And when I've heard you speak about your book before, fortunately for me, you've talked about the society and how the steamboat brought people to the seashore and the travel. And I was reminded, and you might want to remind the audience of this, when Samuel Colt, because you spoke about them transporting his guns, but they also transported Samuel Colt to marry Elizabeth Jarvis in Middletown. So he had hired the Washington Irving, a steamboat, to bring him and all of his friends down from Hartford, and had one big party the whole way there, and then were married at the Episcopal Church in Middletown. And they had the party in a house that's still there, the Jarvis House, which is now Ursula's Web on Washington Street. So I wanted you to just make a quick mention of the society aspect of it, where you said people didn't really go off to their stateroom, they hung together.
Yeah, and that was, a lot of society back then, and going to the beach too. Nobody would, get a tan and lie on the beach. That's not what you did. You went to the beach really to promenade and show off. The wealthy went to show off their finery, their clothes. You see this in Jane Austen. Really, that was kind of what it was like. And the same was true on a steamboat. It was a very social thing. So you went to, after you had dinner in a big communal dining room, and then you climbed up to the deck, to the upper deck, and met your friends, and really showed off, so that was part of it. And Samuel Colt, that's a wonderful story that Maria brought up. When he was married in Middletown, he hired, the same boats which were bringing his pistols down the river, he hired one to bring his wedding party down to Middletown. And that would have been a great boat to be on.
We want to make sure that everyone has time to get their books signed next door. If you have additional questions, also feel free to talk to Eric.
Just one last question.
What were the fuel requirements? Was this wood?
Yes, the fuel, all the wood was used quite a bit in the early days, up until around 1840 or 1845. So it was all wood. So a steamboat needed, good question about fuel requirements, 40 cords of wood to make it from New York, to Hartford. 40 cords. You can imagine wood was piled up everywhere. Coal cut that in half. So then you could store coal, in a coal, below deck, and it didn't take up nearly as much room.
Eric, this one is not a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, one last question.
Where were these boats built, and was there any building along the Connecticut River?
That's a question I get a lot, and a lot of boats were built along the Connecticut River, but very few steamboats. New York, especially Brooklyn, really had it down to a science, and the best boats were built in New York shipyards. So they were almost all built. All the big boats were built in New York.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, again for coming.